Georgia, where East meets West. Tamerlane. Part 4. In 1400, after Tamerlane left Georgia, King George began the difficult task of restoring order in the devastated country. He dealt with traitors and eliminated the remaining enemy garrisons to reassert control. In the Kola field, Lang reorganized his beleaguered army. He succeeded in capturing the city of Sivas, though it came at a great cost. The battle for Sivas was significant. He then ordered 4,000 Armenians to be buried alive. Following this, he captured Aleppo, and in Damascus, he constructed grim towers of skulls from the local people he had killed. Upon entering Jerusalem, Lang visited Solomon's temple to pray. This showed his complex motivations, both political and religious. On his return to Baghdad, he sent 5 commanders with 50,000 soldiers to Georgia. To prevent the enemy from entering the country, King George negotiated with Tamerlane's commanders, promising to come to Tamerlane's camp in person. Lang promptly sent mediators to George with his terms and conditions. Lang was in the Shamka Valley when the mediators returned. They were accompanied by a Georgian delegation led by Constantine Bagrationi. Surprisingly, Lang abandoned his previous demand, King George to come personally. Instead, he received the Georgian delegation with great honor. He listened to the proposed terms of peace, which stipulated that Georgia would pay an annual tribute and provide military support for Lang's campaigns, with a specified contingent. In return, George demanded guarantees for the country's inviolability. According to Nizam ad-Din, Lang accepted the Georgian king's proposal, and a formal peace agreement was reached. Remarkably, Lang pledged not to harm Georgian congregations, an unusual act of clemency. Nizam ad-Din reports that Tamerlane was so satisfied with the agreement that he gave gifts to the Georgian delegation and allowed them to return home in peace. In September 1410, after signing the Shamka agreement, Timur peacefully withdrew to his camp in Karabakh to spend the winter there. Why had Tamerlane become so lenient? Wasn't this the same ruler who, just a year before, sought to annihilate Georgia? Despite George's heavy losses during the 1400 invasion, Lang's forces also suffered significantly. Had Lang really forgotten the conflict? Or did he sincerely trust that King George would keep his promises? This agreement was merely a calculated pretense, nothing else. King George used the time granted by the truce to restore his military strength in preparation for future conflicts. Meanwhile, Tamerlane used the opportunity to secure his rear before confronting an even greater adversary. A decisive confrontation loomed. Since the latter half of the 14th century, the Ottomans had expanded their influence, seizing cities in Serbia and Bulgaria. In 1389, Sultan Bayezid Yildirim conquered all territories from the Aegean Sea to the Danube. In the battle near the city of Nicopolis in 1396, he brutally defeated the combined army of French, Hungarian, and Polish Crusader knights and invaded the Balkans. By 1400, the Ottomans had laid siege to Constantinople. War ravaged Attica and the Peloponnese, and Europe's fate hung by a thread. It was during this precarious moment that Tamerlane emerged as Europe's savior. Constantinople desperate monarchs sent emissaries to the great Asian conqueror, pleading for help. The growing tension between Tamerlane and Sultan Bayezid benefited Europe. Lang had no desire to see a powerful Ottoman Empire rise near his domains. Conversely, Sultan Bayezid had no intention of compromising with the conqueror from Asia. On July 28, 1402, near Ankara, Tamerlane and Bayezid Ildirim engaged in a fierce battle. Chroniclers described corpses piled so high that riders could not cross the battlefield, and rivers of blood carried bodies away. The battle culminated in a decisive victory for Tamerlane. Bayezid was captured. When Bayezid, who was one-eyed, was brought before Lang, Timur burst into laughter. Insulted, Bayezid defiantly addressed Timur, "Day is not without night, death makes no distinctions, and we all turn to dust eventually." Timur replied, "I was not laughing at you. I was amused by the thought that to cripples a lame man, and a one-eyed man led a slaughter of 200,000 men." At this time, Tamerlane was 66 years old. He had yet to complete his campaign against the Georgians, and thus, he deferred any plans for a campaign into Europe. 3 days after his victory at Ankara, he sent letters to King Charles VI of France, King Henry IV of England, and other European rulers through Archbishop of Olifanti. He proposed trade, asserting that merchants forced a peace. Overjoyed by the defeat of Sultan Bayezid the Butcher Sultan, European monarchs eagerly responded with flattering letters and trade agreements. It was advantageous to align with the ruler, who controlled caravan routes spanning from the Far East to Europe. Because of their importance, cities along the caravan routes were spared of Tamerlane's destructive invasions. In 1395, he blocked the only caravan route passing through the North Caucasus. Instead, he favored a route through the Near East and the Caucasus, including Georgia, as the shortest path to the west. These trade routes, alongside the spoils of war, were Tamerlane's true objective in his relentless campaigns in the Near East. For this reason, he sought to subjugate the Georgian state. After defeating the Ottomans, Lang began a campaign across the Near East. In Tamerlane's vision, Georgia was the only state left unbowed before him. Now, the ruler of an immense empire from the Great Wall of China to the Mediterranean, from the Indian Ocean to the Russian steppes, advanced once more towards Georgia's borders. While positioned at Kars, Tamerlane demanded that King George fulfill his promise and come to his camp. George understood that doing so would be futile and leave his country vulnerable. Instead, he sent Constantine Bagrationi with gifts and new terms for a truce. George wrote to Timur, "If you desire peace and service, I am ready. I will send tribute and fulfill my promise, but I lack the courage to come before you, as of the blood spilled on both sides." Tamerlane understood that King George was attempting to flatter him, but the underlying motives soon became evident. Lang's viziers informed him of George's true intent after the Georgian envoys had rested in the camp. It is summer now, and the wheat in Georgia is ripe. If the Georgians manage to harvest, Military actions in Georgia will be significantly more challenging, Lang's advisors noted. Sharaf ad-Din recounts that an enraged Lang threw gifts at the feet of the Georgian envoys, took them captive, and ordered his commanders to invade Georgia and harvest the wheat themselves. What followed was a political maneuver with profound consequences. After the devastating invasions, Georgians resumed cultivating their fields for the first time in years. A rich harvest was anticipated on fields that had long lain fallow. Georgia was now a country where sword and plough, people and clergy, nobility and peasants, all worked together to resist a powerful enemy. Upon hearing Lang's decision, King George swiftly ordered the harvest to be gathered and the Georgians to be hidden from the enemy. Tamerlane's troops reached the fields where wheat remained, gathered the remaining grain, and returned to their camp. Anyone who has ever seen Bertvisi rocky outcrop rising from the verdant fields of Algety in Trialeti will understand why Lang's historians described it as a fairy tale fortress and why its capture was so challenging. In July 1403, the enemy surrounded Bertvisi. Tamerlane himself scouted the area on July 3rd. At that time, Bertvisi was defended by 30 noblemen and 150 warriors under the command of Torelli, and they had sufficient provisions. According to Mu'in ad-Din Natanzi, the Georgian warriors stood atop the rock, singing, drinking wine, and mocking Tamerlane in full view of the enemy. Seasoned commanders urged Lang to abandon the siege, as the rock was impregnable. Lang, however, ordered his men to bombard the fortress from all sides with enormous boulders, and even erected towers opposite the rock, all to no avail. Stones thrown by the Georgians and arrows fired from the cliffs wreaked havoc on the enemy. After a month of fruitless fighting, Tamerlane launched climbers on a dark night from the southern slope, where Georgians least expected an attack. The climbers managed to open the fortress gates from within. After a bloody confrontation, Bertvisi fell. Lang dealt brutally with the surviving Georgians, torturing them. Nevertheless, their resilience cost Tamerlane dearly, as autumn was approaching. A campaign into western Georgia, with its inaccessible valleys where King George was stationed, now seemed to perilous. In a field in Upper Kartli, Tamerlane convened a military council to discuss whether to advance into western Georgia. Exhausted from relentless battles, his commanders were reluctant to enter the impenetrable forests of Imereti. Still, Timur was determined to settle the fate of the Georgians once and for all and force their country into the Islamic realm. This Colchian oak, found only in that region, spread from the Liki Ridge to Kutaisi. Imagine the situation. An enemy accustomed to open battlefields faced dense, impassable forests, with ambushes and arrows aimed from all directions. In a devastated Georgia, Tamerlane's forces destroyed orchards and vineyards, desecrated churches, and advanced towards Kutaisi. Lang's historians do not mention the destruction of castles and fortresses. It simply was not feasible. Winter was approaching, and the snow-covered Liki Range and marshy terrain offered no advantage to the enemy. Continuing the campaign under such conditions, against Georgians fortified in the impenetrable mountains of Svaneti and Abkhazia, seemed impractical. Prolonged battles led to growing discontent among Lang's warriors. Tamerlane sensed that defeat was imminent. Peace was now his only option. However, there was no word from King George, who had fortified himself somewhere high in the mountains. The conqueror's ambition demanded that the initiative for peace come from the Georgians. A solution presented itself. Persian and other sources recount that Georgian prisoners in Lang's camp secretly informed King George of the dire situation. Constantine Bagrationi, held in honorary captivity since his diplomatic mission to Kars, played a crucial role. Thus, the long-desired peace was finally established. Only one condition truly mattered. Tamerlane recognized Georgia as a Christian state. His grand plan to incorporate Georgia into the Islamic sphere was ultimately thwarted. Lang quickly left Imereti. Passing through Kartlis fields, he returned to Tbilisi, and in defiance of the truce, desecrated the city's churches. When examining the walls of our ancient churches, one can still see the marks left by Tamerlane's sword, as in the Blue Monastery. Here stands a wall built during King Tamar's reign, one that even Lang's warriors could not destroy. Upon returning to Samarkand, Tamerlane indulged in feasting. In November 1404, rumors spread that the great Timur was dying, but it was merely a ruse. He was preparing for a sudden assault on China. The rumors had been spread on his orders. Secretly leaving Samarkand, Lang gathered his troops in the city of Otrar. However, on February 18, 1405, he suddenly died. The body of the great commander was returned to Samarkand and interred in the Gari-Emir mausoleum. Immediately after Tamerlane's death, disputes erupted among his heirs, leading to the collapse of the empire that had been built on blood and fear. According to chronicles, following Lang's final invasion of Georgia, King George set about restoring the shattered country. He eliminated the remaining enemy garrisons along his borders and launched campaigns against Nakhichevan and Ganja. The Spanish traveller R. González de Clavijo wrote that King George also led a campaign to Tabriz, looting other cities as well. During this campaign, George destroyed forces sent against him by Tamerlane's grandson, Omar Mirza. With these battles, the Georgian king cleared the approaches to his kingdom while replenishing the treasury with spoils of war. Around this time, Georgia faced an invasion by the Turkmen Kara-Koyunlu. In 1407, during an unequal battle with them, King George VII was killed. Constantine Bagrationi brought the king's body to Svetitsko Valley, where he was buried. Today, some argue that King George's defiance brought only ruin. However, the fact that Georgia remains part of the Western Christian world owes much to George VII. It is often possible to hear negative mentions about King George. as if his intransigence led to nothing more than the destruction of the country. However, if today this is part of the Western Christian world, of which we are so often proud, it is also thanks to King George's contribution. Though you may traverse all of Georgia, you will find no inscription honoring King George. Only on the floor of Svetitsko Veli Cathedral can one read, "Here lies the king who wrested Georgia from the hands of Timur." Continue the history of Georgia.